everyone. Welcome to today's second session. This is the panel on national identity and antiquity. And I am the host, Jaclyn Neel, who is currently here hosting as Jackie and then filming as my own name. So we have three panelists today who are going to start by giving a quick 5-minute summary. I will remind you that this session is being recorded and you have consented to the recording by entering this session. And the chat may be saved and sent to our presenters after this presentation. If you are on social media, you can hashtag this presentation using Antiquity Now or AIMS, AIMS 2021. And I hope that you all have a great time and we have a lot of things to talk about. So our first presenter is Jennifer Rea, who is coming from the University of Florida, speaking on supernatural. And Jennifer, I'll let you get started.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. So my paper investigates why the Roman goddess Fortuna appears in Supernatural and how her appearance intersects with two key questions that the show explores. And the first one is, are the threats to Sam and Dean what Sam and Dean would call the American way of life coming from outside of monotheistic religion, or are they coming from inside of it? And the second question is the American dream actually a realistic one? So what I want to do is show you a clip from the episode, The Hero's Journey, in which Sam and Dean tell their friend Garth that they have been cursed by God.
Kids are finally asleep. How are you feeling?
Better, actually.
I told you.
Yeah. Hey, where have you been?
Getting my teeth fixed.
I had to numb him up. He'll be fine in an hour.
What?
Okay. Seriously. What is going on here?
What do you mean?
I mean, apparently Dean's never been to a dentist before, and suddenly he's got a mouthful of cavities. You're sick, and your car's broken down. Who did you guys piss off?
God?
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah.
God. The God is trying to kill you?
Well, trying to make us kill each other.
So he's a writer, and you've basically been the heroes of his story?
I guess, yeah.
Well, what's that make me, a supporting character, special guest star?
No, Garth, it's not like that.
Oh, no. I want to be the guest star. Being the hero sucks. I mean, sure, you'll probably win eventually, but until you do, your life blows. Your parents get gunned down in an alleyway, your home planet gets blown up, you interview this good-looking rich guy and it doesn't go well, so he shows up at the hardware store where you work, and man, it starts to get,
It's from We Love 50 Shades.
Yeah, we do.
Who's the hero in that?
No. The point is, the hero thing, it's not fun. Well, I mean, there are some good things about it. Like, when was the last time that Batman got a flat tire? Or Superman couldn't pay his water bill?
Or the power goes out in the Red Room.
Exactly. See, the hero never sweats the small stuff. It slows down the story.
So then, what happened? Chuck downgraded us?
Maybe, yeah. And now you're...
First.
No, normal. For the first time in your lives, you're having normal people problems. You need to get a colonoscopy. Stat.
What?
So, how do we fix this?
I don't know.
So Garth eventually goes on to tell them that there is a bar that they can find in Alaska where they can get their luck restored and even get hero's luck. And so they go to the bar and they find the Roman goddess Fortuna there running a pool hall. And the brothers' encounter with Roman Fortuna differs from the other Greco-Roman gods that they encounter in the series. At first, she resists helping them, but finally realizes they are like the heroes of old, self-sacrificing. And her assistance does allow Sam to get the American dream lifestyle, but not the capitalistic one presented earlier in the show. And she does help the Winchesters defeat God, known as Chuck Shirley in this series, and because like her Roman counterpart, she can change the luck of individuals. In Rome, she could change the luck of individuals to help save the empire, and here she's helping save America. So the role that Fortuna will play in Supernatural will highlight the idea that Sam and Dean can be the kind of Americans they want to be, victorious, powerful, modern-day heroes if fortune is on their side. And they cannot finish their mission until Fortuna helps them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I forgot to mention in my introductory remarks that all questions should be sent in the chat to me, preferably to the me iteration known as Jackie, but I will take them either way. So our next speaker is Seán Easton, coming from Gustavus Adolphus College, speaking on Modi's movie Sikander and the fascist film Scipione l'Africano.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this session on this paper. My paper is primarily about one film, but technically about two films. It is primarily about Sikander, the movie poster you see on the right, a 1941 film with an all-Indian cast about the crossing of the Indus by Alexander the Great with his army in 326, where he encountered King Porus, the monarch in the region. It dramatizes the events around all of that. The film which this talk is secondarily about is Scipione l'Africano, a 1937 film by Carmine Gallone. It is the first film put out by the famous Cinecittà Studios. There are many things to say about it. I will be saying a couple of things. I should declare my bias straight away. I love Sikander. I do not love Scipione l'Africano. Sohrab Modi, you see him on the left. And you see also next to him his appearance in Sikander, where he plays King Porus. He is both director and actor, the primary resistor of Alexander the Great, or Sikander. And on the right, you see the very glamorous Prithviraj Kapoor, who played Sikander. Sohrab Modi would primarily be described, I think, in his own view, with the appellation that he was given by many admirers, the father of patriotic cinema. That does not do justice to the scope of his artistry, however. Patriotic may imply for some nationalistic jingoism, and he was considerably beyond that, in the judgment of many and myself. This film begins, this paper begins really about 6 months ago with me, when I discovered, when writing a paper about battle scenes in Sikander, that the close to 100% of battle and battle-related scenes are in fact footage spliced from Scipione l'Africano. That raised for me all the questions that one might have when one suddenly sees this and one associates splicing with plagiarism, fakery. I had to ask myself, this individual, is he the artist I thought he was, and so forth. To cut straight to the chase, yes, that was my verdict, but and my paper is really about that. I'll simply jump to an image in question. So Scipione l'Africano has to do with the war between Rome and Carthage, the Second Punic War. Scipio, the Roman general you see on the left there, addressing his army before the momentous final conflict with the Carthaginian general Hannibal on African ground at Zama. The image on the right you see is the cut going straight from Scipio to actually Scipio from the back. I've circled his head there. You can see it through a forest of what are called fasces, that is the ceremonial rods and axes, of which 12 are held, each one by an attendant around a Roman consul. Here you see on the left, Prithviraj Kapoor as Sikander addressing his army right before it faces off against that of King Porus at the Battle of Hydaspes. The image on the right is the one to which the film next cuts. As you can see, it is exactly the same image as Scipione l'Africano. It is spliced in footage. You can see a little continuity error that ostensibly Sikander is now helmetless. And it was always puzzling to me, but I never thought much about it, why there were fasces in the scene. This gets to why I believe there are fasces in the scene, and why I believe, or what I believe is the primary artistic and political reason behind or alongside any other logistical reasons for the spliced footage. In the scene on the left, or the shot on the left, that is Mussolini riding on a horse. He is being preceded by attendants who are carrying fasces. On the right, you see an image from Scipione l'Africano, where a line of attendants are carrying the rods and axes, and the Roman citizens on each side are indulging in another fascist symbol, the straight arm salute gesture. Scipione l'Africano was very much propaganda from Mussolini. Another aspect of the Mussolini picture on the left is that the two bearers of the fasces that you see there are Ethiopian. Mussolini ordered an invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and 36, and that was the other major political work that Scipione l'Africano was doing, propaganda for that war of Italy against Ethiopia, where Mussolini would speak of Italy truly regaining its empire. Rome fighting against Africa in the guise of Carthage would stand for fighting Africa through the adversary of Ethiopia. Getting back then to the symbolism that we see here, in essence, the Macedonian armies, when they are in battle against the Indians or preparing for battle against the Indians, they are quite directly associated with the fascist wars of aggression in the form of imagery taken from a propaganda film for Mussolini. At other points in the film, however, we are allowed to see a more humane form of Sikander, a complex, deeply flawed form, but a more humane one nonetheless, which speaks more perhaps to the anti-colonialist discourse at work between India and Great Britain. And in this respect, the film is able to take on two massive world issues that affect India in different ways simultaneously through this drama. Thank you. And I hand it over now.
Thank you so much, Seán. And we are now moving on to our last presenter, who is Alison Poe, coming from the Women's Art Journal, speaking on the myth Dior and nationalism in fashion.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks to our organizers, Meredith, Roger, and Dan, and thanks again to Dan because he's also going to be running my slides. And thank you to the audience. My paper looks at the 2020 fashion film Le Mythe Dior, which presented the autumn-winter 2020 to 21 women's fashion collection for Dior Haute Couture. I propose that the film claims both antiquity and fairy tales as the heritage and rightful purview of Dior creative director Maria Grazia Chiuri in her role as Italian fashion designer, even as she helms a Parisian maison. Le Mythe Dior shows bellhops carrying a trunk of miniature Dior looks to a half dozen fantastical forest dwellers, most of whom are adapted, albeit freely, from Greek and Roman myth. The classicizing figures include an animate statue of Venus, Narcissus, who does not get a dress, and various nymphs, including Le Nymphe Dior. Half of the bellhop's customers choose what the fashion media calls goddess dresses, based rather loosely on the Greek peplos. Next slide, please. The iconography of the film's characters draws, with creative license, from ancient works of art as well as intermediary receptions. Excuse me, I'm sorry for my voice, I'm terribly sick today. The statue of Venus, for example, broadly evokes in pose the crouching Aphrodite statue type and the neoclassical sculpture of Venus Victrix by Canova. Her hair resembles the coiffures of the crouching Aphrodite and of the Venus de Milo, with the addition of an ivy crown, which is not a classical attribute of Venus, but a well-known Greek and Roman motif generally. Her grayish-white skin reflects the belief that persists in popular culture that ancient marble statuary was white, a phenomenon David Serrano noted in his talk on Wednesday as manifesting itself in the video game Forgotten City as well. Next slide, please, Dan. Chiuri and the film's director, Matteo Garrone, cite their sources of inspiration as the Metamorphoses, Giambattista Basile's Pentamerone, the City of Rome, and, quote, the legends that missed Rome's ruins. The inclusion on this list of the 17th century compilation of Neapolitan fairy tales, Il Pentamerone, chimes with what I propose is the film's eliding of antiquity with the fairy tale genre. Elements that invoke this genre include the medieval Italian ruins in the landscape, the courtly staging and flare-sleeved dress of Le Nymphe Dior, shown here, the inclusion of the mermaid character, and the dulcimer-like soundtrack. The film is suffused with visual similarities to Garrone's 2015 feature film, Tale of Tales, which is also rooted in Basile's work. Next slide, please. I submit that Italian luxury designers frequently stake a claim to Roman and Greek antiquity as their own heritage, consistent with David Lowenthal's definition of heritage as a construct that fosters a sense of identity and pride. Italian designers make antiquity their own through myriad references in their designs, through funding the restoration of ancient monuments, and by staging shows and photo shoots at ancient sites, many of which Ames member Stacey Rauchi has discussed. Chiuri herself recently held a show at the Panathenaic Stadium and staged a photo shoot in front of the Parthenon and Erechtheion. Next slide, please. I propose that Le Mythe Dior incorporates references both to Basile's and to Garrone's Tales of Tales, and links them to antiquity to frame Greece, Rome, and fairy tales as Italian, thereby highlighting Chiuri's national pride as a Rome-born and based designer, despite leading a quintessentially French luxury house. Given the Dior's label, the Dior label's enormous cultural capital and its broad exposure to a wide range of audiences, Chiuri's and Garrone's reception of classical antiquity in Le Mythe Dior widely affirms the vitality of antiquity as the basis for creative endeavor, which of course is a key consideration for this conference. But the film also presents antiquity as dreamily fantastical. Thank you, and I'll send it back to you, Jaclyn.
Thank you so much, Alison. So that concludes with our presenters presenting their ideas. And so I think I will now take the moderator's privilege of asking the first question. It's very strange to see myself on two screens. I'm going to try to look at the camera. The moderator's privilege of asking the first question, which is that reading through, watching your presentations, I noticed that the primary way that national identity is being transmitted in all of the works under discussion seems to be, at least in some ways, related to the visual, which on the one hand, in a film or a media experience is somewhat expected, but on the other hand, it's also not required. There are lots of ways to have that national identity transmitted without having, a direct visual link. So I was wondering if you could speak, all three of you in turn, a little bit more about the idea of the visual as connected to the national, and what role, if any, we should think of when looking at other works for trying to identify national identity through visual means.
Since I'm happy to answer the question, and it's a great question, and it does really relate to fashion designers, I think, because they are visual. They are artists of sort of a mixed medium, but certainly visuality is important to them, and also I think to Carone, if you see Tale of Tales, it's incredibly visual. I think your question makes me think of Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about, who's a theorist who talks about cultural capital in fashion. And one of the main ways that he sees fashion building cultural capital, that labels get prestige, is by reference to art. And so to make reference to ancient art, through visual means, it sort of accomplishes this building of cultural capital. You get 2 for 1, because you're referring to classical antiquity, which still carries this cachet, and you also make reference to the art world generally, which again makes assimilates fashion to art, which, especially for luxury designers, is an important consideration.
That's great. I actually do have a somewhat follow-up question for you, and maybe I can pause on Seán and Jennifer answering their part of that national identity and iconography question to give you this follow-up. This comes from Tammy Jo Eckhart, who wants to know, who says, Dior is also expanding into Egypt for their fashion shoots, and how does that play into their national identity?
That is an outstanding question, and it's one that I think that I am going to answer now, but I also recognize that Egyptian reception requires a lot of delicacy and is a somewhat different phenomenon than classical reception. But I will say, broad brush, that that as Curie claims both Greece and Rome as her heritage, I wouldn't be surprised if she just sees Antiquity, all ancient things, as a font for her to draw on as an educated Italian growing up amidst ruins. It may be that she sees Egypt in some way also as Italian patrimony. But I'd like to explore that further, and I appreciate the question.
Great. So going back to that question that I had initially asked about iconography and national identity, or the visual and national identity, I wonder if Seán or Jennifer, you'd like to think about how that affects your work, the works that you've been analyzing.
I could give a response. The Sikander handles several identities and I think tries to negotiate them in a number of different ways. With regard to the sort of generalized Indian identity, they use essentially Mughal India as the visual for what ancient historical India would look like. So Sohrab had already done a film called Pukar, which was set in that era of the 18th century, I believe, and essentially that imagery does does the work of representing what I think is otherwise a little bit unknown, which is what the Indian social appearances of all sorts would be at the in the mid 4th century BCE. Alexander, in Oliver Stone's version, does the same. There's one Persian character, and she is shown at one point worshiping at a fire altar. So there is Zoroastrianism in there to give visual cues to, and of course there is Zoroastrians in India, and Sohrab Modi's Parsi heritage has that as well. But that was a sort of an additional visual iconographic lane. And then the classical, which is generalized, I don't know that anything specifically speaks to Macedonian versus Greek versus even a bit of Roman. When I first saw the fasces, I thought that was just general kind of Greco-Roman ancient stuff thrown in there. But it seems that broadly speaking, those are different batches of visual cues to kind of keep different populations in separate conceptual lanes, if that makes sense for the purposes of this film.
If I can ask a follow-up, I mean, so I've never seen Sikandar. I've seen Scipione several times, and my knowledge of the British Raj is somewhat limited to what I learned as an undergraduate history student. But is there a sense, do you think, that that Modi is trying to make that connection explicit with the British self-identification with the Romans in terms of British imperialism, so that this film was chosen not only as sort of anti-colonialist and anti-fascist, but sort of specifically to play on the Britain's own self-identification as Roman? And do we have evidence that they were bringing in Roman iconography to India?
So evidence, because of the lines that my research has taken, I actually have less knowledge of the Roman iconography that they bring in any specific, that the British bring in any specific way, than of Greek and specifically Macedonian, but really just Alexander the Great generally. There is a body of scholarship that shows British both in a more general sense and in a and also essentially amateurs and travelers tended to look very much to Alexander and so forth to kind of configure the modern mythology of British involvement there. The answer with regard to Rome, I can't say for certain, but I would think yes. I'll confess that that's basically my working assumption. I can't think of the evidence, but I would think that Rome would be just a generic part of it. For example, the part of the British classical self-conception, and also the imaginary that Sohrab Modi is bringing to it. The gods in the film are, Zeus is referred to as Jupiter, even though the title of Sikandar himself is referred to as Nikator rather than Victor. So there seems to be a deliberate mixing and matching of those things, and I would think that the Roman dimension would be in there as well, if somewhat imprecisely.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I do want to make sure that we have time for Jennifer also. So Jennifer, one of the things that really struck me looking at those clips, and I admit that I watched Supernatural in its first 3 seasons or so, but not after that. So this was after my time, but it was a nice sort of review of why I liked the show when it first came out. But one of the things that struck me was that coin with Atrox Fortuna, which seems like the sort of thing that a Roman would never actually say, but yet so close to the sort of thing that a Roman would actually say. So I wonder if you could give your thoughts.
So I guess I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. What what was the question?
Oh, back to this idea of the visual relating to the national.
Oh, so I guess I think that coin, I mean, to me, I mean, in terms of the visuals, let me just start with sort of what I saw overall as the visuals, which is, how do you know the American cowboy when you see him? It's the horse and the weapons, right? And then it gets replaced by the Chevy Impala and the much bigger weapons. And then you see Fortuna in this episode on the periphery. And so the visuals for the Greco-Roman gods are always like rural periphery in the show. And I think in Remember the Titans, it gets sort of foreshadowed that, we've been pushed to the perimeter. Nobody cares about us anymore. And then Fortuna really shows up in this episode and states that. So when she sort of gets reduced to this coin in the palm of someone's hand, I think that's also a way of sort of showing that visual. I mean, in ancient Rome, there were, the temples to Fortuna, and then she's out in the rural areas, as the goddess of the plebs too, as well. I mean, sometimes she's got the cornucopia. I mean, most of the scholars I read asserted that there's no one standard iconography for her, but you're absolutely right. I mean, this is more like the idea of Fortuna here than what we would see in ancient Rome. But I did like the idea of her talking about how the Greco-Roman gods have sort of been pushed to the periphery, and then everything in the show visually reinforces that by having her in this remote place in Alaska in the middle of nowhere where she's very hard to find.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's such an interesting idea of the fortune being difficult to find, in the sense of it's hard to get good luck, whereas in Rome, you kind of do have more of that balance of both good and bad. I have another question for you coming from Meredith. Have members of the Supernatural creative team made any comments about how they determined to use Fortuna or other mythical figures in their larger plotting? Given my understanding of the series, the brothers have always spent a lot of time in pool halls making their money through hustling, among other scams. So the setting could lead the creative team to land on Fortuna because of that recurring aspect of characterization.
I haven't read anything specific to that, but I would say that's very highly likely. Like what I saw was sort of these overarching themes that they did seem to, fit together very well. I mean, especially when Eric Kripke talks about how he wants to constantly put you up against this blue collar situation and, give you this epic story, but the problems are being solved by, Sam and Dean, who are the blue collar kids from Kansas.
Great. So our next question is for Seán, and it's actually coming from Alison, who would like to ask it in words. So that is her presenter's privilege. So I will turn it over to Alison.
I'm sorry to invoke my privilege, but I am on my iPad, so it's hard to type. I wanted to see if you saw what I thought I might have seen in the visuals in the stills that you showed of a resemblance to the Alexander mosaic. Because of that wide expanse of sky that is not blue, but sort of whitish gray, whitish tan, with spears silhouetted against it. It reminded me of that mosaic, which would have been known. And I know that Gallone's film is not about Alexander, but it is about conquest of the other. So I wondered if it could have been an influence on the visuals. And then if so, obviously narratively it's more relevant to Modi's film, but in sentiment, perhaps it's opposed. So would Modi have known the work? It might be a very speculative question, but I did see a pretty striking resemblance.
Thank you. And the still that you're thinking of, is that the scene where he's standing on his horse in front of the army?
No, it's actually the one of the expanse of the army generally.
Oh, okay. That had not struck me. It's certainly possible. The only reason that, and I want to be careful, because I think I recognize in myself a tendency to see possibilities in this kind of scenario, to only be able to see the possibilities I've already thought about, and it takes me a little bit of time to absorb a new one. I hadn't I hadn't noticed that, and I wasn't looking for it, but it certainly seems possible. I think there is a definite investment on Gollone's part to bring specifically Roman images to the fore as much as possible. But whether or not, I don't know that that would necessarily prevent him from using an additional enhancement and images that glamorize and glorify conquest. I think that would all seem ripe material and likely material that would have been, Gollone was very invested in trying to get Mussolini to like and be impressed by his film, and bringing Alexander into it might, seem like the Alexander imagery is finally being applied to somebody that it that truly deserves it. So I could definitely, while I can't visualize what you're seeing, it seems very possible, and I will look again for it. So thank you for that.
And although it's believed to copy a Hellenistic panel painting, it is a Roman mosaic.
Right. That's yeah. I hadn't thought of that. That's that makes sense.
So, Alison, while I've got you up here, I do have another question for you. This one coming from Meredith. To further complicate the sense of whose national cultural heritage is implicated in this Dior campaign, do you see the influence of British aestheticism or the pre-Raphaelites like William Morris, J.W. Waterhouse, or Edward Burne-Jones? Some of those stills appear to be staged in poses and settings reminiscent of especially those painters' interpretations of classical myth.
What a great suggestion to look down that avenue. Initially, yes, and I think Gollone's Tale of Tales incorporates those images as well. That's a great line to pursue, because I think you're absolutely right.
Just as a sort of addendum, I think that also may explain, at least in part, that focus on whiteness that you brought up in your paper, since one of the ways that we do see that whiteness myth being transmitted in the late 19th, early 20th centuries is through those artists who are sort of going back with that romantic ideal of the sort of ruins, and those ruins as being bleached white as part of the romanticism, that liking for distressed places.
The capital R romanticism.
Exactly, yes. It's hard to express when you only have to. Yes.
Good point. Both excellent points. Thank you.
All right, I do have also another question for Jennifer, this one coming from Tammy Jo Eckhart. How does the fact that in Supernatural, Dean and Sam save not just America, but the world, indeed all of creation, by the end of the series, play into this idea of national identity?
So that's something I talked about in my paper, the idea of American exceptionalism, and the idea that there's this country ordained by God, with special abilities, and they are absolutely, I agree, saving the world as well. I mean, from the apocalypse, and that is, I think that's pretty much their mission throughout. But I did, want to point out that I think that's very tied to Eric Kripke said the series is tied very closely to a vision of American exceptionalism, and that is part of the American exceptionalism vision that Jason Dittmer talks about as well in his scholarship.
Thank you. I have a sort of follow-up question to that, which again, as I was watching your presentation, I was noticing what a very Christian show Supernatural is in many ways. And I'm going to direct this question to you, Jennifer, but Seán and Alison, if you'd like to also chime in, I think it's relevant to all of these papers, which is that question of how we can differentiate the sort of common aspects of antiquity, like that concept of fortune, which we have in a non-antique context as well, from those direct references to antiquity that we see in shows like Supernatural, where they're brought up as gods. So I guess maybe a different way of thinking about that question is, once we have a goddess Fortuna, are all aspects of that fortuna, that fortune, going to be Roman just by the nature of the fact that she's made that direct reference has been made, or should we see that as also telling us something about our society as well?
Oh, that's an excellent question. One of the things that I loved in some of the scholarship I read by scholars from religion and philosophy and English and film studies have all written on supernatural. And one of the things that they were alleging was, or putting it forward as a thesis, is that we actually learn more about American religious attitudes from shows like Supernatural than we do anywhere else, which I thought was a very interesting idea. And one that's been kind of water cooler debate with me and my colleagues, is this really true? But you're right, when a goddess like Fortuna comes up, or when Zeus shows up and remember the Titans, or Prometheus, like what attributes or what aspects are we looking at? I mean, I think with Fortuna, I identified mainly sort of the liminal aspect of she helps you over thresholds, and then the idea that, she could sort of pick out an individual and change the luck. And I mean, I don't necessarily think we're looking at every attribute or like a direct, like a very direct one-to-one correspondence, but, we are looking for sort of this idea of, like what are our religious beliefs? Like, in other words, like if we're looking at this sort of American identity in the show, like, are we looking at a religious plurality? What are the threats to American identity? Again, coming back to that question of, is it coming from the inside, a monotheistic religion, or is it coming from the outside? I think it all comes kind of back to that question that the creators are asking. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great response too, because it made me think of just how similar some of the questions that we ask are to the basic questions that we ask in Roman religious studies. Like, as a scholar of Roman religion, these are things that I am asking myself all the time. So it's kind of exciting to see that then play out on a larger screen, as it were. I do actually have a follow-up that's related. So again, Seán and Alison, if you could sort of hold off just so I can get this other question to Jennifer. This coming from David Serrano. Do you think that Sam and Dean fighting and defeating gods and the Christian God is connected with the audiovisual trope of demi-heroes opposing divinities developed in previous works such as Disney's Hercules or Neil Gaiman's American Gods?
I would think definitely. So, I mean, I think that we can definitely see connections between the works. That's a great question. I mean, I admit I haven't given too much thought to that, but I think that's a great avenue to explore. So thanks.
Seán, Alison, would you like to comment on this idea of how we separate out the ancient from the sort of everyday?
Could you indicate the context, the ancient from the everyday, just in visuals or in religion particularly?
In any way that you feel is relevant to answering the question. So I think for yours, the ancient model is very clearly looking at Scipione l'Africano, but then Scipione l'Africano also takes ancient aspects that, let me rephrase that, Scipione has already interpreted the Roman past. And so how does Modi engage with some of those interpretations, which are fascist interpretations, differently from ways that we might consider Roman, or more accurately Roman?
I think that my position at this point is that the modern Italian fascist context for that footage and the World War II moment really makes the ancient visuals very, to those who are aware of the outside world, overwhelmingly present in a way that I hadn't really thought about before, especially for anybody who had seen that film, and it would have played internationally. That's why the film reels were available in Bombay, so-called at that time, for Modi to use. I think in those battle sequences, it would be very difficult not to see the invasion of Ethiopia, which was, we might tend to think of it as an obscure footnote to World War II, but it was a central international event, the allowance of which by the world community was seen as opening a floodgate to what became World War II later. So if for me, one of the real reorientations about watching this movie in the awareness of that footage is just how much what one can see tanks and planes now, amidst the swords and spears, if that makes an answer to that question.
Yes, very much so. It's a very open-ended question, I think, on purpose, because we do have such disparate source material to work with in this panel. And I can see Alison has something to say. So please, Alison, let me put you up here.
I don't mean to jump on your toes, though, Jaclyn, if you had more thoughts on that. I don't want to.
Go ahead.
I do really think that the question kind of gets at the heart of what we are and should be trying to accomplish, are accomplishing and should be trying to accomplish as classical reception scholars, as opposed to being scholars. And it's tough for us because we're both. So we want to find the Romanness. We want to find the real Fortuna. What parts did they get right? And I don't think that is almost ever the intentions of our creative subjects. That that Roman. Actually, Fendi uses the term romanity. Romanity is what Fendi is looking for, not at all authenticity. Or it goes back to what we were talking about in the Q&A for the first session of the conference about what makes authenticity. That we can and should look for what we recognize as faithful to antiquity, because it helps us to explain to the world what those references are, but they are always intermediaries. They're always filtered through so many different receptions. And so we also need to be as aware as possible, and it's part of why this job is so hard, of all of those intermediary receptions and understand how they are shaping the end product that has this romanity and that the priority is not for the creative person to achieve faithfulness at all. In fact, it's not a creative endeavor unless it introduces novelty.
I really like that response because it makes me think of one of the interviews with the Coen brothers at when "O Brother, Where Art Thou" came out at the beginning, and everyone said, "Oh, this is such an amazing adaptation of the Odyssey. Where did you get this idea when you were reading Homer?" or some question like that. And they said, "Oh, we haven't read Homer." We haven't done that. And then in the scholarship, people say, "Well, we don't know if that was really true because this is so good in so many ways, that some of the little bits that you see when you do read Homer." But it's, I think, a testament to some of those adaptations of the Odyssey, of Homer in general, of some of the other Nostoi, that we do get that movie, which is so close, but yet apparently so ignorant. So I do wonder sometimes when we look at these later receptions, especially the more modern ones, with that weight of all of sort of that Western heritage behind them, where can we draw the line? And I think with that, unless you had a sort of follow-up comment, I do have one following question, one thought, but no, go ahead.
Well, I don't, again, I'll be quick, but it also sort of directs towards Jennifer. I get the sense that, at least from my designers, that Italians are much more proud of knowing about antiquity, and Americans, like the Coen brothers, might be quick to disavow too much knowledge of the classics, that's not cool. And I wonder if Jennifer sees that in television as well, that there is this sense that Americans shouldn't be too faithful to antiquity because that's like the intellectuals' problem, and Americans were rugged individualists.
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of examples. I know with with Eric Kripke that he said an interesting comment that what he was trying to do was Lord of the Rings, but take out the hobbits and put in blue collar workers, which I thought was very interesting. But I didn't get the impression that he had spent a whole lot of time really thinking about Lord of the Rings. So, I mean, maybe in agreement with what you're saying, there's sort of like the idea of Roman Fortuna rather than Roman Fortuna specifically, or the idea of Lord of the Rings quest without, specific details. So yeah, I think I would tend to agree with that based on what I've read.
So I wonder if kind of on that same concept, again, with a opening to all of our panelists, and maybe I'll actually just add us all to the spotlight so that I'm not constantly moving people in and out. Can we also say something maybe about the concept of heritage versus that concept of national identity? And I think that's something that Alison brought up, but also comes up in what Jennifer was saying about American exceptionalism and that westward focus, and also what Seán was saying about the place of the conquest of Alexander in India's own national tradition. So where does heritage stop and national identity begin?
Well, for me, the touchstone is David Lowenthal, because he does such a nice job of defining heritage as a construct rather than as, as something innate, that it is something we create for ourselves as to enhance our sense of belonging and identity and national pride. So I think it's that the two concepts are very closely intertwined. And again, it's sort of, do our creators want there to be a difference between them, to be a dichotomy? And I'm not sure that they do.
For the purposes of Sikander, that's fascinating. It's a fascinating question to think about, because on the one hand, technically speaking, there wasn't a national identity. There wasn't a nation. There was an Indian National Congress that was building toward a nation, and there were, there were competing visions all at work, and that's one of the things that that Sora Modi was, trying to navigate in all of this. He makes Alexander's romantic partner in the film, Roxana, he follows the tradition that she's Persian rather than Sogdian, and makes her Persianness key to the relationship that she forms with King Porus, which it allows her to trap him into saying that he would spare Sikander when he has the chance to kill him. So heritage, and this was an Iranian-Indian co-production. And there's also the fact that India was still ruled by Great Britain. So in a certain sense, that's, somewhere between heritage and national identity, that element is in there. Now, I think one piece of heritage, and this is extremely under-theorized. This is just me watching the film saying this. There's this notion in Indian films of the time and subsequently of the village as eternal India. So whether the film is set in the 18th century CE or the 4th century BCE, there is an Indian village, and there you will find the Indian people. And that trope is very much present. And you see there in broad, sometimes comical terms, resilience and courage and piety, and a lack of the self-doubt and flaws that even King Porus, who is the noblest character there, has, because he loses to Sikander partly because he fulfilled his debt of honor in the battlefield. He could have killed Sikander and he did not, because he swore he wouldn't, and he lost the battle. And then he spends part of the film just, angsting over this. What will it say about him, and so forth. And it's the humble Indian characters who fight for them, fight for their king, fight for their country, and even after they've lost their battle, they're satisfied that they fought because they protected the honor of their country. And it almost doesn't even occur to them that they lost until that they see the lights are out at the palace, which means that the king must not agree with their general state of satisfaction about things. So that's where I would chart heritage as opposed to national identity in that film.
Thank you. And since we are running a little short on time, I want to go straight to Jennifer.
Thank you. So I was thinking in terms of heritage that one of the things we see in, I think, both Rome and Supernatural is sort of the idea of humble origins and then great beginnings coming out of it. And I know I've had some discussions with Meredith about national identity and when does Rome really get this sense of national identity. But I think the two, as Alison said, are very closely intertwined with the idea of the values coming from Rome's humble origins to the values coming from small town America, helping to build that identity, even if at some point you leave that sort of small town origin behind to a certain extent in the national identity you want to represent.
And thank you for being so quick, Jennifer. That was amazing. Just to kind of quickly follow up on that and then give our closing announcements, I do wonder if, to follow up on those three responses, whether the reason why we see that maybe stronger connection in Jennifer's and Alison's work than in the works that Seán is studying is because of the connections, Curie's direct connection with Rome, and then the sort of American idea of the republicanism of the USA. Whereas with Modi, maybe we don't have quite that close connection between either Greece or Rome and the nascent identity of India. But with that, I'd like to invite our audience to give some applause to all of our presenters, because this was a very impressive tour through a large portion, really, of the world, from India to the United States to Fantasyland. And I just want to give people some announcements of what's coming up. At noon, there's going to be a book launch, noon Eastern. So in about 14 minutes, there's going to be a book launch of Screening Love and War in Troy, Fall of a City. That will not be in this Zoom room. That will be in the other Zoom room. So you'll have to leave and then come back. Immediately following, or soon following that book launch at 1:15, so in about an hour and a half, there's going to be our business meeting, and then there are further panels going on throughout the rest of the afternoon as well. So thank you once again to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for submitting your questions and for attending. And I will see all of you later on at the conference.
Thank you, Jackie.